Medical visits often feel rushed and impersonal, leaving patients feeling frustrated and shortchanged. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dr. Silva. Thank you for joining me. This is part 2 of a 2-part series on patient self-advocacy. In video 1, I gave some tips on how to make the most of your visit with a psychiatrist, including urging patients to be respectfully assertive and how to gently insist that the physician spend the time you need and answer all your questions and concerns when appointments begin to feel rushed. In today's follow-up, I'm going to focus on some of the other ways in which practitioners go astray and what you can do to recognize when it happens and how to resist it, how to make it better. Recognition is key. You may not have your doctor's expertise, but you don't need to ensure that you receive at the very least the standard of care. What is the standard of care? Doctors sometimes get caught up in time constraints, use too much medical jargon or medicalese, or worst of all, make decisions about care without fully involving the patient, adopting a course of action when there are options to be discussed. And doctors can also be dismissive of symptoms. I'm going to talk about each of these in this video and offer some solutions, how to recognize those scenarios and how to advocate for yourself. I talked about time constraints and being assertive in part 1. Being assertive doesn't mean being disrespectful. You can be polite and still exercise your right to advocate for yourself and get the care you need and deserve. Most doctors welcome that. That's the thing to remember. We as providers really do want to do the best job we can. Now, of course, there are terrible doctors out there who are lazy and who don't know what they're doing and who don't care about their patients. The world can be a treacherous and unfair place. But listen, those quacks are in the minority. They truly are vastly outnumbered. And odds are you're in competent, decent hands. The rest of us are working hard and doing our best, but the pitfalls are still there, and an otherwise compassionate, competent, and well-meaning practitioner may unwittingly fall into them for a number of reasons. They're pressed for time, they're overworked, they're very green and inexperienced, or the opposite, they've been practicing for years and they're experiencing burnout, or they may be going through some personal problems of their own that are causing actual impairment. We're all human beings. We're all mentally and emotionally unwell at times. All of us are mentally ill at times, and anyone who denies that is being arrogant, in my opinion. We all have brains, we all have central nervous systems, and we're all vulnerable to mental illness, even if it's just for a few days every now and then. Mental illness can come and go, and doctors get sick too. And there are other reasons doctors make honest mistakes. But we all want to do our best, and even the less than stellar practitioners out there don't want to get sued. So we're all fairly open to feedback from the patient that allows us to course correct in real time. If I'm doing something wrong, or the patient thinks I'm doing something wrong, I want them to speak up. So it's important that you as the patient are able to recognize these pitfalls and sidestep them yourself, and help your provider to sidestep them. I guess this is a good place to remind everyone that I've developed an entire curriculum based on these facts and these needs. There are millions of you out there subject to psychotropic medication trials. If you're watching this video, then you're either taking psychotropic medication or you're on the verge of doing so. And there is so much education that needs to be happening that simply isn't. And that's why I established this channel, first for my own patients, and now I'm here to offer it to a broader audience. But to access my premium content, you have to visit my private online academy and consider enrolling as a prospective student. Please check it out at notonanemptymind.thinkific.com. There's no obligation. Signing up for the newsletter is free. If you're interested in future offerings, including amazing freebies that you won't hear about even if you're a YouTube subscriber, I urge you to visit me at my Thinkific Academy. I really hope to build a community over there, so please check it out. So, what are some of the pitfalls? Jargon is the easiest to deflect. If the doctor starts using terms that aren't familiar or don't make sense, don't be shy about asking for clarification. But there are those that have trouble interrupting and asking for definitions and clearer explanations. Those individuals are experiencing clinically significant anxiety in those moments. Interpersonal anxiety, period. That's what that is. If you can't bring yourself to stop your doctor and ask for something to be repeated or explained using different language, then you're experiencing a symptom. And that should be a focus of treatment. Tell your doctor. Confess your anxiety, as I like to say. And the anxiety will diminish in the confession of it. Just like when you're embarrassed and you admit that and the shame begins to dissipate a little bit. Have you ever noticed that? When you're embarrassed, confess it. Say, oh, this is embarrassing. and you begin to release it. And the reaction you get from others is usually compassion. Other people usually don't want you to be embarrassed. They can help you not to be, because the anxiety there is interpersonal, i.e. social anxiety. The presence of other people is triggering it. You can't be embarrassed when you're alone, right? Unless you're imagining. And the fact that it's a secret makes it worse, because then people worry about it showing or other people finding out how nervous or insecure they are. So the best way to conquer that fear is to tell them. The anxiety diminishes when you confess it. It loses the power to blackmail you. Try that next time you're experiencing performance anxiety before a speech or an important meeting or interview. Confessing the uncomfortable, unwieldy emotion unburdens you. Or at least your burden diminishes, because now you're sharing it. It's interpersonal anxiety. And even though we call it social, it can occur in the context of professional interactions, including the doctor-patient relationship. But who better to share with the fact that you're too timid to ask for your provider to slow down and repeat themselves and do a better job of explaining things than your provider, especially when that provider is a psychiatrist. It makes sense. And it will give you immediate relief from the irrational emotion that makes no sense. Anxiety spectrum conditions are plagued with irony and irrationality. I talk about that in other videos. Some patients are really cowed by the doctor's authority. It stifles them, ironically. And those patients who don't want to bother the doctor with phone calls or messages between visits are the same ones that are loath to interrupt and ask for clarification because it seems rude, or they're afraid of looking stupid. The thing is, it doesn't always involve medicalese. Other times, it has more to do with a complex explanation of your condition or a complicated treatment rationale that needs to be reiterated and or broken down into more explicit, logical steps for the patient to better grasp. It doesn't mean you're stupid or dumb, and there should be no embarrassment. There are no stupid questions between doctor and patient. If you don't understand, if you don't get it, ask for help. A separate but related issue that I've often mentioned is when the patient uses jargon and the clinician fails to verify that the jargon is being used correctly. The problem stems from the fact that some terms in psychiatry are used colloquially and the doctor is making an assumption. Terms like mania and panic occur in the vernacular, and so when a patient uses them, if the doctor doesn't ask the patient to break down those symptoms, doctors and patients could be talking about two different things. Two entirely different things. This happens especially with mania, and is one reason bipolar disorder is overdiagnosed, and there are millions of people taking mood stabilizers who don't need them, in my opinion. I have separate videos on this, the overdiagnosis of bipolar disorder, and how patients should be skeptical. Please check them out. In nephrology, terms like interstitial nephritis are not in use by the laity. A patient isn't going to stroll into the kidney specialist with a chief complaint of interstitial nephritis. "Hello, Mr. Smith, how can I help you today?" "Well, doc, last night I woke up with a bad case of nephritis." Doesn't happen. But patients come in all the time talking about their mania or their panic or their ADD, convinced of their proper use of those terms, perhaps bolstered by the fact that they've used them before with other providers. But it's not in fact mania or panic that they're talking about. And it's just that no one's ever bothered to check. Doctors can avoid this pitfall by ensuring that we're talking about concrete, well-defined symptoms and not diagnostic labels. Panic is a diagnostic label. It comprises chest pain, rapid, shallow breathing, difficulty breathing, tremor, sweating, dizziness, lightheadedness, intense fear, an urge to flee, a fear of dying, etc., etc., etc. Any or all of the above in various combinations. If you tell me you can't breathe and you feel like there's an elephant on your chest, I can't misinterpret that. And so I make patients describe things to me in terms that can't be misunderstood. So I know what we're treating. What patients can do here to advocate for themselves is to get specific without being prompted. Don't wait for follow-up questions that may or may not come. Just don't use labels or terms. Talk about specific sensations and thoughts and perceptions and urges and behaviors. The same with mania. It comprises sleeplessness, agitation, grandiosity, rapid speech, racing thoughts, flight of ideas, impulsivity, expansiveness, poor judgment, hypersexuality, hyperspirituality, profligacy, etc., etc., etc.
etc., etc., etc.
Even racing thoughts needs to be dissected because unfortunately, that term too has entered the vernacular. It's been downgraded by popular speech, by soft definitions that aren't operationally defined. They vary depending on who's talking. And so they stray from what psychiatrists mean when we talk about racing thoughts. Even when doctor and patient are both speaking English or French or Spanish or German, they may need an interpreter. So be your own interpreter. Don't rely on the clinician to catch that, to be astute enough to catch that. Hopefully you have an astute clinician, but you might have somebody who doesn't have that much experience or who's distracted, pressed for time. You be your own advocate. And clinicians out there, be attuned to this pitfall. The second mistake I want to talk about is when the practitioner makes a decision that deprives the patient of an option or options. We're going to presume that it's a mistake, that it's an oversight. The decision may be the best course of action. The provider certainly thinks so, ostensibly. But regardless of whether medically it's best, we still have to obtain informed consent. And if we deprive the patient of a choice, of a vote, and the patient actually has veto power, then we've not obtained informed consent because the patient is in the dark. I remind patients all the time that the decision is theirs to make. It's their body, their life. They are the boss. They're in control. I can't force them and wouldn't try. I can lobby, and I'll do that, but they've hired me to do a job, and that job is to determine symptoms and derive a diagnosis and make recommendations. This can be a much more difficult pitfall for the patient to discern. But if your doctor jumps to trying to get your permission for a specific treatment without even telling you why that treatment is being recommended, you can ask about what factors they considered in coming to that determination, whether or not there are alternatives and why they were rejected. I recently came up with over 100 questions in 60 categories that patients might ask their providers, and questions number 14 through 18 prompt the clinician to explain the selection of medication, the reason for the specific final recommendation. If you want a copy of the entire list in PDF, comment "I want the list" below, and I'll send you a link for a free download. Get in the habit of asking why. I often discourage patients from asking why about their condition or their symptoms, because most of the time either we don't know or there is no why beyond genetics. Why do I have this? Why is this happening? But do ask, why this treatment? Why this medication? Why now? And what are my options? The doctor should provide options, but you can get in the habit of asking for them. That's advocating for yourself. That's what I mean by self-advocacy. Knowing what to ask and knowing what to ask for. So many patients don't even know what to ask. How can they? If you want a copy of the most important ones I could think of, comment "I want the list." And there is no scenario in which the doctor could correctly answer "there are no other options." That's a wrong answer, folks. Because you could always opt out and just go right on living with your symptoms. That's always an option. Or no change to an existing medication regimen. There are always those options. So there are always at least two options. But usually a lot more because there are several medications within each class from which to choose, and it's highly unlikely that you've exhausted them all. It's unlikely that you've exhausted all of your options. That's rare. And if you have, we need to take a closer look at the diagnostic process. I can't overestimate the value of shared decision-making, especially in mental health. So if you sense that your doctor is taking decisions or making recommendations without your input, then it's time to speak up. Prompt your physician to do a better job. Not by saying, "Hey doc, do a better job," but by prompting them, by asking questions and making requests that inspire less experienced or less astute clinicians to step up. I always give options, but I make my vote clear before asking the patient to deliberate, because my opinion, the expert opinion, even though it is just a professional opinion and not a fact, should carry some heft. That's helping the patient to decide. And the golden question in that scenario remains, why is that my pick? Which is a great question that should prompt further discussion. All of these questions are meant to enable a dialogue between patient and provider. Another mistake otherwise well-meaning clinicians make that undermines patient advocacy is dismissing symptoms for a number of reasons. Maybe the provider is not, in fact, well-meaning and doesn't care, or is otherwise disengaged, or is lazy, and so is dismissive by default with all of their patients. Thankfully, that's not a common situation. But in psychiatry, the clinician can't always take the symptom as reported at face value. It has to be scrutinized, always. And you providers out there really take note of this. Why? Why is this especially important in psychiatry? Because in psychiatry, symptoms are often not what they seem. And we can't verify with an X-ray or a biopsy or a blood test. We have to go by what the patient is telling us. Terminology has to be checked and verified, as I've just mentioned. For another thing, patient reliability has to be gauged. Is the patient being honest? That's not always the case. It certainly makes my job harder, but it's not uncommon at all. It happens all the time. Patients lie all the time for all kinds of reasons, but with experience, it can usually be determined fairly easily and fairly quickly. And so the hard part is how you handle the patient, what you say to the patient when you know that they're not being honest with you. And depending on what their motive is, and there's an approach. I'm so much better at it now. I was so bad at it. I would just confront them with their dishonesty when I was younger, but now I've got skills in that department. So sometimes patients are being dishonest. So that's one reason to scrutinize. Or is the patient being sincere but delivering unreliable information anyway? Again, for a host of reasons: poor insight, confusion, poor memory, confabulation, other cognitive deficits. Patients have blind spots. They can't see it all. None of us can. Symptom reporting is always by its nature subjective, but in psychiatry, that subjectivity can be taken to ridiculous extremes. Patients can be delusional, for one, but more commonly just mistaken. Sometimes psychological defense mechanisms like rationalization, minimization, and denial come into play and need to be identified because that skews the reporting of symptoms. Somatization is another unconscious defense mechanism that results in a physical symptom the patient then misattributes, when in fact the symptom is anxiety, masquerading, as anxiety loves to do. So those are just some examples, but psychiatric symptoms have to be scrutinized because often they aren't what they seem. Over time, clinicians can grow skeptical, jaundiced in their approach, and the clinician's mind narrows or even closes. And if the patient has a certain interpersonal style, that can trigger bias on the part of the clinician. For example, if the doctor suspects a personality disorder and they've had trouble dealing with those types of patients in the past, histrionic patients or patients with borderline personality disorder, the doctor isn't good with those patients, doesn't like treating them. It's unprofessional, but a patient interaction can get miscast in the provider's mind, and bias can cause the clinician to dismiss a symptom or symptoms out of hand that are actually bona fide. Oh, the patient's being histrionic. Oh, yeah. I've seen that before, and they ignore a lot of it. Also, if there are a lot of complaints, a laundry list of complaints, one after another, the patient doesn't even take a breath, that doesn't serve you. Or the complaints are loud and seem exaggerated or to contradict one another. Anxiety can be the culprit there too. Too much noise can cause the doctor to ignore some of it. Being disorganized, jumping from one topic to another, not prioritizing symptoms and complaints, all of that can be held against you, particularly at the first visit by a new doctor who doesn't know you and who doesn't know any better. In video 1, I talked about being prepared and prioritizing and writing things down. If you feel that your doctor is ignoring a specific complaint or minimizing your difficulties overall or is being dismissive of you, then it's fair to politely but firmly insist on reiterating and discussing those complaints. But prioritize them. Don't pick 20. Prioritize and be focused and be calm. You should receive at the very least reassurances, but there should also be actionable options for each complaint. When I'm not so concerned about a particular symptom, I'll explain to the patient why I'm not worried about it, what I think the symptom is, what it's likely attributable to, and why we can proceed conservatively and just keep our eye on it, or why I expect it to improve with the treatment options that we've already discussed in detail. That I'm not ignoring it, I'm not dismissing it. I give explanations, not just reassurances, explanations. If you give your doctor the opportunity to explain something by asking about it, then even when they are minimizing, it will prompt them to take a closer look. You can't ignore something you're explaining. Your doctor will be less likely to minimize a symptom that they have to reassure you about if you ask for an explanation. Whether they realize they're minimizing or not, if you ask for the doctor to verify their certainty, that forces them to pay attention and you get to discuss it. If you do continue to feel dismissed, get a second opinion. Finally, always ask about follow-up. What comes next? Make sure the doctor has a roadmap. I'm always thinking several steps ahead, what I'm going to recommend if the patient doesn't begin to improve right away or if a medication fails us, a plan B, a new set of options, plural, we'll have to consider if the first maneuver is not a home run. We often have to tweak the regimen, and certainly medications often need to be titrated. Sometimes we have to use augmentation strategies, which involves adding a medication. It's uncommon to get no improvement at all if the medication choice was thoughtful and judiciously administered in terms of adequate dosing and other parameters, but especially with patients who have conditions that are partially refractory to treatment, I'm always thinking 2 steps ahead. What am I going to do next if this fails too? Most patients do not have recalcitrant symptoms, though. Whatever else, don't leave without knowing what happens next. How are you going to gauge improvement? Question number 43. And then what? What about the long term? What comes next? What comes next here is another video and more great content. But please don't forget my premium content at notonemptymind.thinkific.com. Thanks for listening, and as always, questions and comments are